The spaceship Unity Horizon hummed softly, a mechanical purr that Zrika found oddly soothing. For all her years aboard interstellar vessels, this human-designed craft was perplexing, far too chaotic and cluttered, like its creators. Humans were curious creatures, unpredictable and loud, but undeniably resourceful. And today, she needed their infamous ingenuity. Zrika tapped her sleek alien communicator, her 4 fingers typing rapidly. The engine diagnostics report flashed before her, confirming her earlier suspicion: the stabilizers were dangerously misaligned. Without a dynamic torque calibrator, a device she lacked, they'd be venting plasma by morning. "Borrow from the human," suggested her colleague Rinix during their brief consultation earlier. "He always has tools. Strange ones, but effective." So here she was, outside Lieutenant Travis Carter's quarters. The door hummed as it slid open. Humans were notorious for their disregard of privacy. No need to knock when the ship's design assumed no one had secrets. Zrika stepped in, her gaze immediately falling on the human sprawled across his bunk. Travis lay on his back, shirtless, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep sleep. His hair was tousled, his expression blissfully relaxed. Beside him on the mattress was the object of her mission, a shiny, cylindrical device unmistakably identified as a dynamic torque calibrator. Her gaze lingered. It wasn't her fault. Her species, the Ellerics, found humans' physicality strange yet oddly mesmerizing. Their lack of symmetry, their soft skin, so unlike her own sleek, scale-like exterior, was fascinating in the way a chaotic starburst was beautiful. But it was the placement of the tool that left her momentarily frozen. The device rested at an angle across his lap, half obscured by the blanket draped over his hips. Zrika blinked, her neural nodes firing rapidly as her mind processed the tableau. Her species associated such postures with readiness for courtship. "Logical analysis," she muttered under her breath, attempting to steady herself. "Tool clearly unrelated to biological functions." Still, her curiosity gnawed at her. Why did humans sleep in such vulnerable positions? Did they not fear intrusion? She edged closer, her movements silent. The calibrator gleamed enticingly, and her 4 fingers twitched with the urge to snatch it and leave before the human woke. As she leaned over him, her face inches from his exposed chest, the human stirred. A groggy voice, deep and slurred with sleep, broke the silence. "Zrika? What the hell are you doing in here?" Her composure faltered, her translator implant scrambling to decode the human's tone. Sarcasm? Annoyance? Confusion? She straightened, her hands still poised over the tool. "I require your device," she said, her voice steady despite the strange tension crackling in the air. "The dynamic torque calibrator is essential for repairing the stabilizers." Travis blinked, his drowsy eyes sharpening as he processed her words. Then a slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. "You mean my tool?" "Yes, your tool," she replied, her tone clipped. "I was attempting to retrieve it without waking you, but your biology appears to lack efficiency in dormancy states." He laughed, a low chuckle that sent a ripple of heat through her sensory nodes. "Well, if you wanted my tool, you could have just asked. No need to sneak into my room and hover over me like a creeper." Her neural nodes flagged the term, creeper, as derogatory, but she ignored it. "Your calibrator was within reach, and I assumed expedience was preferable. Am I incorrect?" Travis propped himself up on one elbow, the blanket slipping slightly. Zrika's gaze flickered involuntarily, and she cursed her species' overly observant nature. "Well, Zrika," he drawled, his grin widening. "Next time, try knocking. It's a human custom. You don't just barge in when someone's got their tools out." The double meaning in his words escaped her entirely, but his tone suggested humor. She tilted her head. "Humans find amusement in mechanical instruments?" Travis laughed again, this time louder. "Something like that." He reached over, plucking the calibrator from his bed. "Here. Take it. But maybe next time, let a guy know before you go rummaging around his private quarters, yeah?" She accepted the device, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was fleeting, but her sensory nodes sparked with an intensity she hadn't anticipated. She recoiled slightly, the sensation both startling and strangely pleasant. Your epidermis generates an unusual warmth, she noted, her voice almost clinical. Travis raised an eyebrow, clearly fighting the urge to laugh. Thanks? I guess? Without another word, Zraika turned on her heel and marched out of the room, clutching the calibrator like it was a lifeline. Behind her, she heard his voice, teasing and amused. Don't forget to return my tool, Zraika. It's my favorite one. Her neural nodes flagged his tone as overly familiar, but she dismissed it. Humans were strange, she thought as the door slid shut behind her. Strange, warm, and entirely too distracting. Travis leaned against the doorframe of the engine bay, his signature smirk firmly in place as he watched Zraika work. She was bent over a control panel, her slim, scaled fingers gliding over the holographic interface with precise movements. For someone so uptight, she had an oddly graceful way of working, though he doubted she'd appreciate the observation. So, Zraika, he began, voice casual but laced with amusement. Do all LRX engineers sneak into people's rooms at night, or am I just special? Her head snapped up, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. I informed you of the urgency of my task, she replied, her tone clipped. Had you been awake, the intrusion would not have been necessary. He chuckled, stepping closer and setting a steaming mug of coffee on the console beside her. Fair enough. But you've got to admit you made it sound like something entirely different. Zraika glanced at the mug, her nodes lighting briefly as she scanned it for contaminants. Clarify, she demanded, turning her full attention to him. Travis tilted his head, clearly enjoying himself. Come on. You walked into my room, said you needed my tool, and then stared at me like I'd committed some kind of intergalactic crime. It's a little funny. I failed to understand the humor, she replied, her brow furrowing. He leaned against the console, sipping his own mug of coffee as he studied her. You really don't get it, do you? Humans have a knack for double meanings. When you said tool, it sounded like you meant something else entirely. Her eyes flickered with realization, and her nodes dimmed slightly, signaling discomfort. A euphemism. Your species' reliance on ambiguous language is highly inefficient. Maybe, he admitted, but it makes life interesting. Besides, I think you're warming up to our quirks. You haven't walked out on me yet. She stared at him, her expression as unreadable as ever. If I leave, the stabilizer will remain unfixed, and the ship will face critical failure. He grinned, unbothered by her deadpan response. And here I thought it was my charm keeping you here. Zraika ignored the comment, turning back to the console. If humans derive entertainment from linguistic ambiguities, it would explain your affinity for unnecessary complications. Complications make life fun, he countered. What's the point of being logical all the time? You miss out on the surprises. Surprises often result in catastrophic outcomes, she said, inputting a series of commands. Not always, he said, setting his coffee down. Sometimes they lead to, I don't know, interesting conversations with alien engineers who break into your room at night. Zraika paused, her fingers hovering over the interface. You continue to frame my actions as improper when they were entirely justified. Is this also a human method of humor? Maybe a little, he admitted. But mostly, I just like getting a rise out of you. It's cute. She froze, her nodes lighting up in a ripple of soft blue. Cute? Yeah, he said casually. Like endearing. You know, the way you try to pretend you're all logic and no emotion, but you're just as curious about humans as we are about you. Zraika's nodes brightened further, and she turned back to the console, her movements stiffer than before. Your presumptions are baseless. My curiosity is strictly professional. Sure it is, Travis said, leaning in slightly. So, when you were hovering over me in my room, totally professional? Her hands stilled, and she turned to face him, her expression hard to read. I was observing the position of the calibrator. Right. he said, the teasing lilt in his voice unmistakable. And the fact that I happened to be shirtless was just a coincidence. Zraika straightened, her tone sharpening. Your state of undress was irrelevant to my objective. Elric's engineers are trained to disregard distractions. Distractions, huh? He said, his grin widening. Didn't realize I was so distracting. She sighed, turning back to her work with a muttered, Humans are insufferable. Maybe, he said, stepping back. But you don't seem to mind. For a moment, silence filled the engine bay, punctuated only by the soft hum of the machinery. Zraika's nodes flickered faintly, her movements regaining their usual precision as she worked. Travis watched her, his smirk softening into something almost genuine. Hey, he said after a while, his tone lighter. For what it's worth, you did a good job with that stabilizer. And thanks for not, accidentally blowing up the ship while you borrowed my tool. She glanced at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. You are welcome. Though I suggest you keep your tools stored more appropriately in the future. He laughed, a warm, easy sound that made her nodes flicker again. Noted. But where's the fun in that? Travis set the coffee mug down with a soft clink, leaning slightly on the edge of the console. Zraika continued her work in silence, her focus unwavering, though her illuminated nodes betrayed the heightened processing happening beneath her composed exterior. The quiet stretched long enough for him to speak again, this time with a tone that was surprisingly genuine. Zraika, I wasn't kidding earlier. Humans really do thrive on complications. Keeps us sharp. Keeps life interesting. She didn't glance up, her attention seemingly glued to the holographic display. Your species' tolerance for chaos is well documented. Though, I find it less interesting and more perplexing. Let me guess, Travis said with a grin. Elric's culture doesn't do chaos. Everything's perfect. Controlled. Predictable. Precisely, she replied. Predictability ensures stability. Stability ensures survival. Sounds a bit boring, he said, folding his arms. Boredom is preferable to destruction. Zraika countered, her tone clipped. It is illogical to invite unnecessary risks when stability is attainable. See, that's where we differ, Travis said, his voice light but his words deliberate. Humans believe the best things happen when you take risks. It's messy, sure, but it's worth it. She finally looked at him, her expression neutral but her glowing nodes revealing a flicker of curiosity. What do you mean by worth it? Moments like this, he said, gesturing between them. Two completely different species, learning to work together, maybe even laugh a little. That's not something you can plan for. Zraika tilted her head slightly, studying him as though he were a particularly stubborn puzzle. Humans prioritize emotional satisfaction over efficiency. It explains your penchant for reckless behavior. Reckless or brave? He challenged, his smirk returning. Unnecessarily intertwined concepts, she replied. He laughed softly. You'd make a great philosopher, you know that? Her nodes flickered again, this time with a faint glow of confusion. Philosophy is an impractical pursuit. Disagree, Travis said. It's all about asking the big questions, figuring out what really matters. Like, why are you here? Her brow furrowed. I've explained this. The stabilizer required repair. No, he interrupted gently. Why are you really here, Zraika? On this ship, working with humans? Doesn't seem like the kind of thing your superstructured species would jump at. She hesitated, her fingers pausing mid-command on the console. For a moment, the ever-present hum of the engine filled the space between them. I volunteered, she said finally. Why? Her gaze dropped, the faintest flicker of discomfort crossing her usually composed features. I wish to expand my understanding of interspecies collaboration. My people value such endeavors. Travis said, clearly unconvinced. And what do you value? Her eyes snapped back to his, her tone sharpening. Efficiency. Progress. The advancement of knowledge. Sure, he said, leaning forward slightly. But what about fun? Connection? Do those ever make the list? Those are subjective concepts, she replied, her nodes glowing faintly. They lack measurable benefits. Travis raised an eyebrow. You really think so? Because last I checked, you didn't walk out when I started teasing you. And you're still here talking to me? Her nodes pulsed brighter, betraying her internal struggle. Leaving now would be inefficient. The stabilizer's performance must be monitored for anomalies. Right, he said, his tone playful. Totally about the stabilizer and not the fascinating human in front of you. She straightened, her posture rigid. Your self-assessment is overconfident. Maybe, he said with a grin. But you haven't denied it. Her silence stretched just long enough for him to chuckle softly. You know, he continued, his voice gentler now. I get it. Different worlds, different rules. But I think there's more to you than logic and efficiencies, Rika. I think you're curious about humans, not just how we function, but why we are the way we are. Her nodes dimmed slightly as she considered his words. Curiosity is not a flaw, she said finally, her tone quieter. Definitely not, he agreed. It's what makes life exciting. And maybe a little chaotic. She glanced at him again, her gaze lingering longer this time. Chaos does seem to follow you, Lieutenant. Call me Travis, he said, his grin widening. We're friends now, right? Friends? She repeated, the word unfamiliar on her tongue. Yeah, he said. It's a human thing. Means I've got your back, and you've got mine. Even if you do break into my room unannounced. Her nodes pulsed faintly, a soft glow that almost resembled warmth. Your definition of friendship is acceptable. Glad to hear it, he said, his voice light but his expression sincere. So, friend, what do you say we keep this ship running without blowing anything up? That would be optimal, she replied, her tone softening ever so slightly. Travis laughed again, the sound filling the engine bay as they returned to their work, the unspoken understanding between them growing stronger with each passing moment. Several cycles later, the ship's stabilizers were running flawlessly, and Zrika found herself at a rare moment of reprieve. She was seated in the observation deck, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. The infinite complexity of the cosmos had always calmed her, its orderly chaos resonating with her need for balance. Yet tonight, her thoughts were anything but orderly. You're not working? Travis's voice cut through her thoughts, drawing her attention to the doorway. He was leaning casually against the frame, holding 2 mugs of what she now recognized as coffee. His relaxed posture and ever-present smirk were becoming oddly familiar. Annoyingly familiar. I completed my tasks ahead of schedule, she replied. There was no logical reason to remain in the engine bay. So you do know how to relax? He teased, crossing the room to join her. Mind if I sit? She gestured vaguely to the seat beside her. Do as you wish. Travis plopped down, setting one of the mugs in front of her. Figured you could use this. Helps with the whole relaxation thing. She eyed the mug with suspicion. Caffeine is a stimulant. Its effects are counterproductive to relaxation. Fair point, he conceded, taking a sip of his own. But it tastes good. That counts for something, right? She picked up the mug, her nodes lighting faintly as she brought it closer to examine the contents. The earthy aroma was oddly inviting. Taking a cautious sip, she blinked in surprise. It is acceptable. High praise coming from you, he joked, leaning back in his seat. They sat in silence for a while, the stars outside casting a soft glow across the observation deck. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. If anything, it felt easy. You know, Travis said after a while, I used to think space was the loneliest place in the universe. Big, empty, cold. But then I got out here, and it turns out, it's not so bad when you've got good company. She glanced at him, her nodes flickering softly. Humans are notably social creatures. It is unsurprising that isolation would affect you negatively. True, he admitted. But I think it's more than that. It's about finding the right people to share it with. Doesn't matter how vast the universe is if you've got someone who makes it feel a little smaller. Her gaze lingered on him, her nodes pulsing in a soft, contemplative rhythm. Ellerichs prioritize collective harmony over individual connections. Relationships are viewed as functional rather than emotional. That sounds efficient, he said, his tone careful. But doesn't it ever feel like something's missing? She looked back at the stars, her voice quieter now. It is not something we dwell on. Our focus is on progress, not sentimentality. Maybe sentimentality's underrated, Travis said, his grin softening into something gentler. Sometimes it's the little things that matter most. Like sharing a cup of coffee. Or teasing someone until they almost smile. I do not smile, she replied, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Not yet, he said, flashing her a playful wink. She shook her head slightly, sipping her coffee in silence. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice lower, more thoughtful. Zrika, can I ask you something? You may. Why'd you really volunteer for this mission? And don't give me the standard cultural exchange answer. I'm asking what it means to you. Her grip on the mug tightened slightly, her nodes dimming as she considered his question. I wish to challenge myself. To experience something beyond the predictable confines of Ellerich's society. That's brave, he said, and she could tell he meant it. It's not easy stepping into the unknown. It is disconcerting at times, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, he said, leaning closer, for what it's worth, I think you're doing great. And if you ever need someone to help you navigate all this chaos, you've got me. Her nodes flickered brighter, the soft glow betraying the emotions she was so careful to suppress. Your offer is noted. He laughed softly, shaking his head. You're impossible, you know that? Perhaps, she said, a faint trace of amusement in her voice. They sat there for a while longer, the silence between them no longer feeling vast. The stars outside continued their endless dance, but for the first time in a long time, either of them felt alone.